Hey guys, Andre from High Performance Academy. Welcome along to this week's members webinar. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that on face value seems pretty straightforward, choosing a suitable set of injectors for your project. However, as you'll find out, there are a few more things that you might need to consider that maybe you hadn't thought straight off the bat. So we'll jump into that in a few minutes, but we do that, just a quick update on what's been going on around here over the last week. And we'll start by a quick update on our black V886 race car, the one that's got the big ugly hole in the side of the block. At the moment, we are waiting for all of the components to come back from our machinist, so probably still a few weeks away from that happening. There's a bit of work going on there. The existing cylinder heads that came off the donor engine are going through a CNC porting program. They've been fitted with a larger set of SuperTech valves, so oversized valves, just to improve the flow. And it's a case there with the 1UZ, 2UZ, 3UZ cylinder heads that the porting program is quite critical to the flow, probably, goes without saying, but it's not a case of bigger is better when it comes to porting, which is something that I think people maybe don't quite understand. So it's not just about getting big numbers on the flow bench, it's actually about maintaining the air velocity in the ports. Otherwise you can end up with a cylinder head that might make reasonable flow at high RPM and wide open throttle, but could completely destroy in particular low RPM torque, which is something that we want to manage quite carefully. So the company that we're working with, which is Hartley Race Engines, they've been developing these engines for a long time for the local stock car scene as a control engine for one of the classes here. And the ports in stock form actually are probably, if anything, a little bit oversized. So it's not a case of adding more port volume to those ports. It's just a case of smoothing and reshaping them slightly to try and get the best possible results without destroying the air velocity. At the same time, to bring people up to what's happening with that engine, if you haven't been following, we started with a 4-litre engine. We're making about 450 flywheel horsepower, trying to get a little bit more engine capacity and engine power into our new build, which is why we started with the 4.3 litre variant, the 3UZFE, and that does that by increasing the bore. It retains the same stroke. So what to do is go to a 1mm oversized bore on the 3UZ block, which is about as large as we can go without custom, something we didn't want to go through because of the complexity and hassle factor, not to mention the cost. And then on top of this, we are also going with a very mild offset grind on the crankshaft big end journals to increase the stroke. So then we end up with custom pistons and custom rods. So it's going to get us to just a touch under 4.5 litres. And it might sound like a reasonably big hassle and expense to go to for what is less than 200 cc's additional capacity. Granted it is. However, when you are dealing with a naturally aspirated engine, there's only a couple of levers we have available that we can pull to make more power, and capacity is one of those. So that's what we're going with. So the moment the heads are being ported, the engine block can't be touched yet. We're waiting for some custom pistons to be made for that engine. So we're hoping JE will be dealing to that in the not too distant future, and we'll keep. For those who are interested, we will be covering the build of that engine broadly in our vlogs, but we'll also be adding that as a worked example to our practical engine building course, which is going to be perfect for those of you who want to dive in a little bit deeper and get a little bit more in depth with the process of stripping, designing and rebuilding any of the 1UZ, 2UZ or 3UZ family of engines. Now, one of the problems we did face last season with this car, and again for those who aren't familiar, we've been running it in a 1-hour endurance race series here in New Zealand. This year we're on the idea we may end up running both a 1-hour and the 3-hour variant of the endurance series, just depending how everything goes and what our time frame looks like. What we did find though last year, particularly at one of the racetracks we visited, which is called Ruapuna, probably about 6 or 7 hours north of where we are here in Queenstown, is that the brakes weren't really up to the task. Ruapuna in particular has a very, very harsh braking area coming into turn 1, braking from somewhere around about 230, 235 kilometres an hour into quite a tight second gear left-hand corner. And of course that takes its toll on the brakes, and what we've found is two problems with the brakes. First of all, we ended up doing a lot of damage to the right front rotor because we actually wore through a brand new set of pads during our practice and test day prior to racing. Interestingly enough, the left-hand side, the front brake pads were probably less than half worn. And this is something that's an aspect you do need to keep an eye on with modern cars running ABS. We can get to this situation where we have quite uneven pad wear. The reason for this is that particular braking area, you start braking in a straight line, but you are sort of braking slightly into the corner as well. So you're trail braking into the corner. And what this does is with the ABS system, the left front becomes unloaded. So under a conventional braking system, you'd risk locking the front wheel. Of course, with the ABS, that's not an issue. The braking system just reduces the left front. But we've still got maximum pressure going to the brake pads on the right front. So that's why we got that uneven wear. So one of the issues we're facing there is getting some more cooling airflow to the front brakes. So we'll be addressing that. But what we've got here is what we're going to be adding to the rear of the car. Existing brakes on the rear of the car were actually stock, just with some upgraded endless pads. So that's a relatively small diameter vented rotor coupled with a slider style single piston caliper. Now the reason this was the situation we're faced with is this was how the car was built when we purchased it. And to a degree, for sprint races, there'd probably be nothing wrong with that. Quite a lot of people tend to over rear of the car, and the reality is often that's unnecessary. It's just adding additional weight and spending a lot more money where often you don't need to. The reason, of course, being that the front brakes do the majority of the braking work. But at a point where we are at with a car that is only used for racing and endurance racing for that matter, the rear brakes start to become a bit more of a problem. So we were running into issues with the heat in the rear brakes, basically getting to a point where, first of all, the brake pads were no longer in their happy sort of operating range, so we weren't getting good effectiveness from the rear brakes. But the other those who have been following us for a while will know that we were chasing some problems with CV and CV boot life with our drive shaft shop axles in the rear. And it's a bit of a stretch, but one of the things we wanted to do was try and get some heat from the brakes out of the hub assembly where it's going to be transferred into the CV. We were getting issues where basically the CV grease was getting so hot it was turning into a liquid, and basically that's where we were getting CV wear. So if we jump across to my laptop screen, long story short, what we did for the last couple of rounds that we raced at, we ended up stealing the D2 4-pot brakes off the back of our racecraft Toyota 86, and they got us through, probably again slightly overkill for what we were needing to do, but of course now we've got the racecraft car with stock brakes on the back, and that's not really ideal either. So long-term solution was we ended up picking up a set of the endless brake rotors, brake calipers I should say. Let's just grab those and we'll put those under the overhead camera. So these are a 4-pod or 4-piston caliper, so you can see the individual pistons in there that operate against the pad, and also it's definitely not uncommon. You can see that the pistons are different sized, so I've got a large piston and a small piston. The idea behind this is to try and reduce pad taper in the way the pads wear. The other aspect here with basically any aftermarket brake caliper is the design trying to get rigidity into that caliper so it doesn't flex, so that basically all of the effort from the driver's pedal is being transferred directly into the brake pad against the rotor. So this is a monoblock style caliper. Now, we've had those sitting around for quite a while. These were actually brought into New Zealand as a test caliper for a brake kit that never ended up getting developed for a local racing series. We get these at a reasonably good cost. The thing as well is if we just turn this over and go back to our overhead, we've got this little sticker on the side of it which gives us an indication of the brake caliper temperature as well, which is quite critical for the life expectancy of the brake fluid. So it gives you an idea of how much heat's getting into the caliper. Of course, if we get the brake fluid too hot, that ends up boiling and gives us a long pedal, which isn't exactly reassuring from the driver's perspective. The other aspect is the brake pad or brake rotor temperature also has a really big impact on our braking performance. We don't want that too hot or too too cold, or we risk having our brakes not work as well as they can. So that's our caliper. We recently just received the rotors as well. So these are a little bit of a complex aspect with the back of our Toyota 86. So we'll get this under our overhead camera for a second, and we can see these are two-piece. So we've got the brake rotor here, and then we've got this alloy hat. So from this side, doesn't look too different to most two-piece rotors. However, the rear of the Toyota 86, if we flip this around, and this isn't too uncommon, has an integrated handbrake assembly that sits inside here. So it's basically a drum handbrake rather than the handbrake operating through the brake caliper itself. So this makes this component, the actual hat to mount all of this, quite a lot more complex than a conventional rotor. So it took us a little while to get hold of these. These are actually quite nice as well because the hat itself is alloy, but the part that the handbrake component runs against is, I think it's a cast iron, so basically low wear. If you're running that handbrake against the alloy, obviously that would chew that up really quickly. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. It does add to the unsprung weight on the car as well. So at the moment, the only component we are waiting on there is a adapter bracket to get those calipers mounted up, and that's again where Brandon, our in-house 3D design specialist / 3D printer specialist, is going to come to the rescue. He will be designing up a bracket, prototyping that on our 3D printer, and then once we're happy with the fitment and we're comfortable that everything's going to work properly, we can have a proper bracket machined up in alloy. So that will be happening. No real rush there, obviously, when we haven't got an engine back in the car, and we won't have for some time. Right, just a quick update. I did mention last week that we have been busy filming our Racecraft sister company's corner weighting course. I will just jump across to the laptop screen for a moment, and this is a shot of the corner weight scales. So again, for those who haven't been following us for a while, I'll just quickly mention what this is all about. So most people understand that when it comes to getting best performance out of the race car out on the racetrack, that the wheel alignment is critical, getting the camber, the caster and the toe settings right at each corner of the car to optimize the tire contact patch on the racetrack. But the other aspect which is a little bit more subtle and not quite so common, is corner weighting the car, and this is all about getting the balance of the car set up so that the car will respond equally for at least a circuit or road race car in left-hand corners and right-hand corners. So what we can see here is we've got our car sitting on our scales, and we've got our corner weights being shown. So we've got all four corner weights being shown here, and this particular display at the moment is showing, we can see there's two little arrows here. So what it's doing, the intercomp corner weight scales are automatically adding up the weight of the left front and the left rear wheels, and that's giving us a total here. So we can see that the total on the left hand side of the car, 631 kgs. If you prefer to work in pounds, don't worry, these work in pounds as well. But then it also represents it as a percentage. So you can see at the moment 49.5%, just to round, of the total car weight, which is shown down the bottom, is being put onto the two left wheels. So that's one aspect, but very difficult to affect the left weight percentage without actually moving ballast or components around the car. Perfect if you are building a car from scratch, have access to a set of corner weight scales. You can use these while you're designing and building the car and just play around with the location for some of the heavier components in the car. Talking here about aspects such as the driver's seating position. That can be manipulated sometimes a little bit. More common though is moving heavier items such as the battery, a sump tank, fire suppression system, etc. Moving that around to optimize the corner weights as well as we can. Now, it's unlikely, particularly with a production-based car, that you are going to get that perfect just by ballasting or moving components around. However, the next technique, which is what we're teaching in this course, is to use ride height adjustments at each corner, essentially jack weight around the car. And generally, the parameter that we're most interested in is the left rear and the right front together and express that as a percentage of the total weight. This is called the cross weight percentage, and by jacking weight around the car, we're trying to get that for a car that's going to handle the same in a left hand corner and a right hand corner. Generally we want to have that sitting at around about 50%. So if those of you out there who want to take your knowledge to that next level when it comes to setting up cars for circuit racing or basically any form of motorsport, corner weighting is a really critical aspect in getting the most out of your car. And we're getting to the final stages of that filming, so hopefully we'll only be a little ways away on launching that course. Pretty excited about that. Now also we'll head across to our High Performance Academy Instagram page here, and this is a post I put up about 4 days ago here. That's something really often overlooked, but probably one of the more critical aspects, which is here we can see we've got a pointer fitted to the front assembly of the engine pointing at an ATI damper, and we can see on that ATI damper there is a degree marking that runs around the outer shell of that. So this is all an aspect of dialing in or setting up our base ignition timing, which is one of the setup aspects that we should always be going through before we start tuning any engine. Essentially what we're trying to do here is we are trying to align the timing that we see on our laptop screen with a timing light, so we know that the numbers that we're seeing on the laptop screen actually represent what we're seeing at the crankshaft, or in other words what the engine is actually receiving. It's so easy when we're sitting at the comfort of the car with our laptop screen to just blindly trust and believe the ignition timing values that we are seeing on the laptop screen. But if someone hasn't previously set the base ignition timing correctly, it could be completely incorrect. Now, in a best case scenario, we may find that the ignition timing is much more retarded than we expect, and this could result in subpar performance, leaving a lot of potential power and torque on the table. But in a worst case scenario where the ignition timing is actually much advanced than we are expecting, we could potentially end up damaging the engine. It could suffer from detonation when we think that we've got really conservative timing in there. So this is such a critical point to make sure that we cover off in our setup, and this is why it's got its own step dedicated to it in the HPA 10-step process that you'll find in our practical standalone tuning. Now, one of the problems comes in that often there won't be factory timing marks on the front cover of the engine that we can trust. Particularly if we've gone to an aftermarket harmonic damper, then there also may be no timing marks. So we may end up in a situation where we need to create our own. Even if we have timing marks, often the factory ones actually aren't that reliable, they aren't that accurate, and it's always a good idea to go through and make your own accurate TDC marker so that we know where the timing is. This can be done relatively easily. I just use a positive stop that we can wind down into the spark plug hole for number 1 cylinder. The idea with this positive is that we want to adjust it so that it's stopping the piston just below top dead center. We're then going to very carefully wind the engine over by hand in one direction until we come up onto that positive stop. We'll make a mark on the crank pulley, the damper versus the pointer that we've got on our front cover or whatever we're using as a reference, and then we're going to wind the engine over the opposite direction until the piston comes back up onto that stop. So basically this way we're going to have 2 marks, and we know that accurate top dead center is exactly between those 2 marks. So really quick and easy technique to set that up. It doesn't take long to do. You can buy brass positive stops that are adjustable. They have different spark plug sizes, or you can simply modify a spark plug with a stop welded to the end of it. Whichever way you go though, the critical aspect is to make sure that positive stop gets removed before you ever try and start the engine, otherwise you're going to very quickly punch a nice round hole in the top of your piston. Right, lastly as well, I just wanted to give another little prop to our new vlog series that we are running on our YouTube channel. So we'll head across to that. This is last week's episode, which was covering some of the intricacies of flashing on our Subaru STI. So this was basically filmed in conjunction with the practical reflash worked example that we've just filmed using ECU flash. It's not quite out just yet, it's just in the final throes of being edited now, but basically we talk about the factory calibration, how it works, and why there is potentially a lot of power left on the table with factory tunes. In this particular example, we found that in stock form, the Subaru ECU runs incredibly rich, to the order of about a 10.5, 10.3 to 1 air fuel ratio. And I can't remember the exact. If you want, you can go and watch that episode you'll find on our YouTube channel. But we picked up somewhere in the region of about 30 kilowatts, basically by leaning the air fuel ratio out. Basically exactly the same boost pressure. We haven't really changed that. A little bit more ignition timing because the factory timing was pretty conservative. So it can be a really powerful way of improving the performance of a range of different cars. In particular, the cost for this system is quite cheap. The software that we're using there, ECU Flash, the reading, the writing, and the modification of the maps, and ROMRater for the logging, both of those software packages are open source. They are freely available, costs you nothing to download them. The only cost is the Tactrix OpenPort 2.0 cable that we are using, that interface between the OBD2 port on the vehicle, the laptop. So that's also suitable. We're obviously dealing with Subaru here, but it's also suitable for Mitsubishi as well, very commonly used in the Mitsubishi world. All right, that does it for our pre-show there. Give me a couple of moments and we'll get started with our webinar.
If you like that video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, and if you're not already a subscriber, make sure you're subscribed. We release a new video every week. And if you like free stuff, we've got a great deal for you. Click the link in the description to claim your free spot to our next live